Good afternoon and welcome to Opinion Journal. I'm Mary Kissel. Big changes today in Washington and the foreign policy establishment. Susan Rice is taking over as National Security Advisor from Tom Donilon, and the president nominated Samantha Power to take over as Ambassador to the United Nations. Here to comment is Fox News commentator and author Monica Crowley. Monica, so do you have to be a yes man or a yes woman to rise to power in this administration?
Well, there does seem to be a pattern, Mary, where if you fail or if you lie to the American people or if you design and carry out policies that are detrimental to America's interests, that in fact you do get rewarded with a promotion.
Yeah, I think that lying comment refers to Susan Rice and Benghazi. I think we've got a clip, actually.
Our current assessment is that what happened in Benghazi was in fact initially a spontaneous reaction to what had just transpired hours before in Cairo, almost a copycat of the demonstrations against our facility in Cairo, which were prompted, of course, by the video.
Well, let's focus in on Susan Rice. What does her record say about her views of American power in the world?
Well, before we address that, I think it's very interesting that he is promoting her to National Security Advisor, given that Benghazi is still in play and that the American people and members of Congress still have no answers as to what really happened that night, what led up to the attack, who gave the stand-down order, where was the president, where was the Secretary of State, the cover-up that subsequently followed with the invocation of the video, which we all know was a lie, and Susan Rice went out 5 Sunday morning shows and repeated that lie. What's interesting about the promotion to this job is that, generally speaking, National Security Advisors are considered off limits in terms of testifying. So it may very well be, now it's not impossible, but it may very well be that by promoting her to this position, President Obama is trying to take her off the table in terms of testifying about that night and about how the video fiction came into play.
Could have
so on.
insulated her.
Right.
You know, my colleague Brett Stevens did a terrific column on Susan Rice's career, particularly in Africa, because she has a long record to look at in foreign policy. And the way that I read it, she was another utter failure dealing with conflicts in Africa, cozying up to dictators. What's your read on her record?
Brett Stevens called his great column "Failing Up."
Failing Up.
And I wrote a blog about this on my website today. Without seeing Brett's column, I also called it "Failing Up" because that is the perfect phrase to describe Susan Rice and Samantha Power, who, by the way, is going to be taking over for Susan Rice at the UN. Susan Rice doesn't really have a worldview and doesn't really have an idea or some sort of doctrinal concept of American foreign policy, American power, how we should be exercising power in the world. What we can see based on the last 20-25 years of Susan Rice, she was very prominent in the Clinton years, very prominent obviously in the Obama years, is that what guides her is not some sort of overarching view of America's place in the world and how we should be carrying out power and protecting our interests and advancing those interests, but more of a political calculation. Everything kind of goes into this political lens and calculation where, you know, when she was trying to deal with genocide in Africa, Rwanda, and elsewhere in the 1990s, it was always, well, how is this going to play in the Congress? How is this going to play in the next election?
So she's a politico, like Jack Lew at Treasury. However, Samantha Power does have a view of American foreign policy abroad. I've got a quote that I want to put up on the screen from March 2003, The New Republic, and I quote, "U.S. foreign policy has to be rethought. It needs not tweaking, but overhauling. We need a historical reckoning with crimes committed, sponsored, or permitted by the United States." Monica, from the sound of this, she thinks that the United States is a force for evil in the world.
Yes, and she is the perfect epitome. She's the perfect example, Mary, of the far left. They believe that America is not a force for good in the world, but a force for evil, a force of ill. And look, President Obama believes this as well. He hasn't been quite as explicit as Samantha Power was in that comment, but it explains his approach to the world, which is that America needs to be taken down a notch or 2 or 10, and that takes the form of retrenchment abroad, gutting our military here at home and abroad, and apologies. That's what his foreign policy has essentially been for the last 5 years. So she is right in line with that. The other thing is her overarching doctrine, Mary, is called responsibility to protect. She created this doctrine that the United States should be intervening wherever there is a slaughter. President Obama invoked R2P, as it's called, responsibility to protect, as a basis to go into Libya when Muammar Gaddafi had not yet launched an actual slaughter. So he used that as a basis to go into Libya when there was no humanitarian crisis. However, in Syria, where you actually do have a slaughter of upwards of 80,000 people, it's been going on for 2 years.
Chemical weapons use.
There's no, exactly, as far as we know, there's no responsibility to protect being invoked here, whether it's by Samantha Power or the president. So whether or not you agree with going into Syria, going into Libya, America should have a consistent application of these kinds of doctrines, and there isn't one.
Well, is it a good thing then that he's putting her at the United Nations, where she can do much less damage than at defense or at the State Department?
How about not in the administration at all? That would be my choice. But look, at the UN, she is, because she has this philosophy, I'm wondering, Mary, who's going to be representing America's interests at the United Nations? Because with this kind of view of the world and America's place in it, she is not going to be representing us very well or standing up to dictators and tyrants and regimes and forces like terrorist organizations that are opposing us and attacking us all the time, because she actually believes that America is at fault and may on some level deserve this kind of opposition in the world.
One thing's for sure, Monica, we are going to be faced with some very, very dangerous times in the months and the years ahead with this team in charge. Indeed. Fox News commentator and author Monica Crowley, thanks so much for being on the show. You bet.